Orcs climb the ever-spiraling staircase of orc hierarchy by deeds not heroic but by strength, viciousness bordering on stupidity, and most importantly, survival. Charging straight into an overwhelming enemy force not because of notions of bravery, but because if you survive, well, there's your proof of what a good fighter you are. Scars awarded in battle are worn as medals and provide suitable conversation pieces at the Space Orc pub when on leave. Orcs obviously don't believe in luck. The higher an orc rises in hierarchy, the more spoils are awarded. And what would a responsible orc invest in? Prime real estate? Extra time with the PT? Well, whatever's left after the visit to the pub goes into more armour and bigger guns. Actually, quite a sensible investment, a pension plan of sorts, but with a bit more fun involved. But what about the scars? If you cover your body in armour, no one can see your very permanent list of battle achievements. And that is where I started to try and figure out how to paint my heavily armed and armoured orcs for my venture into Stargrave, the tabletop skirmish game from Osprey Games. These orcs are going to be my pirate shock troopers, a foe that can randomly appear on the table, hopefully closer to your opponent than to you. Anyway, there's not much orc left, really, more like cyborg. I wanted to create an armour that once would have been painted, but after many a brawl and the occasional falling out of the hammock at night, is now worn, scratched, chipped and scarred. Chipping can be done in various ways. One can just paint it on like an optical illusion. I've seen wonderful takes on that. One can also use something called chipping medium, essentially painting on an underlying layer. Then once that layer is dry, brush on the medium wherever one wants chips. Finally, after the medium is dry, cover everything with an overlying layer. The chipping medium can in the end be dissolved with water, removing the overlying paint wherever there was medium, thus revealing the underlying paint. The same method can be done using hairspray, I believe, instead of chipping medium, although in that case airbrushing on the top layer is a necessity. However, I've had in the past a few issues with these options. The two major ones are lack of randomness and lack of fine detail. And this is where I had my eureka moment, and I wasn't even in the bath. Some time ago, Green Stuff World sent me a prototype of a product labeled Frost Serum. For some time now, commercially available as Liquid Frost. I used this on a winter diorama. The liquid frost is a magic-y liquid that in essence grows small crystals. The end result is a lovely frosting effect that when overdone can grow pretty large crystals. When working with this in the past, I've labeled the product as something for dioramas because the crystals are very fragile, and also discovered, most relevant to this video, that the crystals easily dissolve. The cool thing here is that the liquid has a life of its own. When the crystals grow, they grow, to our eye, randomly, shooting out like branches off a tree. So could I use it like a chipping medium, but a self-growing and randomly expanding and retracting chipping medium? The crystals are very fragile, so this would all have to be done with the airbrush, but would the crystals act as sufficient blockage for the overlying layer? I started out with the base layer, the underlying layer. This will theoretically be seen as the material under the paint. Applying a type of zenithal prime but with metallic paints ranging from a magnesium darkened with brown and black ink, in steps moving up to an aluminium with some dashes of ink in between to add some colour here and there. The result, a slightly brown-tinted metallic surface that is darker in the recesses and brighter on the highlights, but also gradually darker towards the bottom of the miniature and bright up top. Now, if one wants to be sure not to ruin the underlying layer when doing chipping like this, and to help the chipping along, varnishing before adding whatever chipping medium used can be a thing. But I figured this glossy metallic paint would not need it. I added the liquid frost to anywhere on the mini that would be scratched, so edges primarily and wherever there would be wear and tear. The process in its entirety was pretty sloppy, and this is somewhat of a beauty. Relying on the growth of the crystals to do the fine work for me, knowing that a blob of liquid will in fact become something detailed and organically shaped. The liquid takes a little time to start growing into crystals, and one can feed the growing crystals with more and more liquid to make them grow larger. I ended up adding 2 to 3 layers to make sure I got the tree branch-like growth going. On larger areas I didn't want to get covered with more paint. I used either regular chipping medium or masking putty, and then it was time for more paint. Again, going for a zenithal style approach to try and match the previous metallic layer, I started out with a black in all the recesses and then worked my way up with brighter and brighter paint. The choice of colors was a bit of an experiment, going for a couple of shouty options but also making a few bad choices. In the excitement of not knowing if this whole thing would work out, my yellow turned green and my orange turned brown, but the magenta turned out great. And while on the subject of eagerness, my first attempt to remove the liquid frost was, well, let's just say the overlying layer of paint wasn't even dry. But after irritating the family with some impatient prancing around the apartment, paint dried and subsequently the liquid frost came off wonderfully easy, using just water and a soft brush. And I've got to say, for me, this is the best chipping I've ever done. The minuscule details, the random growth of the crystals, I was happy. And this is where the video could end, but as usual, it's not. I wanted to go in and add some general highlights to get some more depth into the paint, add more saturation to the colors already in place, but also to enhance the chipping effect. By highlighting the edges of the top colorful layer, usually the edges facing upwards towards the head of the miniature, creates an optical illusion of depth in the chipping. Oh, and I painted a parrot. You can't go around being a Space Orc Pirate without a proper parrot on your shoulder. Going for the most classical pirate, Polly wants a cracker parrot scheme I could find. Orc skin and other details were painted, but that already has its own video. Anyway, armor. Not only highlighting the colorful areas of the armor, but also giving the metallic layer some edge-style highlights with bright metallic paints. And working in reverse, toning down and tinting some of the shaded areas of the metallic paint with inks. Trying to get the 2 layers, the metallic and the color on top, to match up. My final layer of highlights, not on the metallics but on the colored bits, was using fluorescent paint. This is something that has been recommended to me at some point. Essentially, when one feels done with highlighting, just adding a thin layer of fluorescent paint on the absolute highlights will give that little extra boost. Especially on miniatures like these, that most definitely live in a sci-fi world. The fluorescent gives the mini a tabletop colorful boost and a feeling of future rather than past. There was one last thing that was bothering me. The lack of unification between the metallic and the paint on top. This is, in my opinion, something that any chipping can suffer from, however it was done. And I wanted to make the 2 parts feel like they exist in the same environment. My plan to tackle this was with weathering effects. First off, a water-based streaking grime, a transparentish paint that looks a lot like engine oil. Goes on all the parts that one probably would want to keep well oiled. Going into battle with a chainsaw that jams is just a bit embarrassing, even for an orc. And then, after a layer of varnish, I added an oil-based rust. Orcs are not embarrassed by rust. So, does one have to varnish before using oil washes or oil paints? No, especially not if one really wants to get some decent staining. I'm varnishing so that if I want, I can completely remove the oils with the help of white spirit from areas I definitely don't want stained, like the very fluorescent highlights. I then made my own oil wash, a mix of blue and purple oil paint with a decent amount of white spirit. And this goes on most of the shaded areas facing down, binding both the metallic paint and whatever color is on top together, giving them a sense of similar shadowy reflections, not only on the one miniature, but on all 4 as a group. Lastly, some grey pigment powders, space dirt. I haven't been using any brown, earthy pigments on my sci-fi venture. Mud has such a medieval tinge to it. Grey, on the other hand, concrete, debris, plastic refuse, moon dust. I mean, it practically shouts sci-fi. And there we are. Painting on top of the chipping, like I did, can in some places ruin the fine and detailed effect. Something to consider. Also, varnishing before adding the liquid frost is definitely something worth considering. Overall, this is very dependent on airbrush work. I do try and keep my airbrush work at bay when it comes to do videos, remembering the feeling when starting out in the hobby of not fully being able to appreciate videos based on airbrush. But this time around, the liquid frost effect was just too good to pass. I'm really looking forward to getting to try this out on larger pieces, vehicles or terrain, and really try to grow the crystals larger, just to see how that looks. This was a surprising use of an effect meant to create ice. But it goes to show one shouldn't always pay too much attention to what things are meant to be used as, rather use them for whatever comes to mind. I would like to end with a humble thank you to all my patrons. I don't thank you enough. And also encourage any non-patrons to please consider supporting my work. Thank you all for watching.